Okay, so we've been talking about the compactness theorem. Uh, Here's something. Okay, yeah, the the compactness theorem for first order logic. We went through a proof of that, and what I would like to do today is to go over the proof, make sure that we understand the details just once more, and then talk about applications, and then move on to the next problem. Okay. So, what is the statement of the theorem? Theorem: every finitely satisfiable set in SAT, which really means every finite subset is satisfiable. So the way we go about it, you start with gamma, which is a fin SAT, and then you observe that gamma need not be complete. Basically, this means there is an exercise here, right? You must construct a set which is infinite finsat but not complete, right? You must construct a set which is obviously not complete and show that it's every finite subset is satisfiable. So this is, we observe that a finsat and complete set need not be witness fulfilled. What is witness fulfilled? Whenever there exists X alpha belongs to gamma, implies for some term T substitutable for X in alpha, alpha with X replaced by T belongs to gamma. You say gamma is witness fulfilled if whenever it includes an existential formula, it includes a witness for it. Some term is a witness for it. This is what it says, right? That term should be something that you can substitute with it. So this is what is witness fulfilled. Again, this is an exercise. You should be able to construct a set which is finsat and complete, but not witness fulfilled, right? How would you do that? Well, you have to make sure that it's complete, right? I mean, so you can take a complete set, but you must argue that even if it is finsat and complete, so there exists at least one set like that. So this tells you that this is actually an extra condition, right? To say that it's witness fulfilled. So what we do, the proof is basically given gamma, which is finsat, extend gamma to delta, which is finsat, complete, and witness fulfilled. Then, based on delta, define a model. Oops, not this. M delta such that for all formulas alpha,
If you the chat message saying there's some audio disturbance.
Is it there now? I think one of the persons had audio on. Now it's all off. So it should be okay. Yeah. If there is a problem again, tell me. Yeah. Yeah. Then you define a model M delta such that alpha belongs to delta if and only if M delta satisfies alpha. And that ensures that all the formulas in delta are satisfiable. And yeah, this says that delta has a model and gamma is a subset of delta, therefore gamma has a model. So this is our proof strategy. Now, the problem is that in the process, what we did to extend it to a witness fulfilled set, you expand the language. So what you get is so expand L to L prime, and delta is a set in L prime, right? Therefore, this is an L prime model. So what we get is an L prime model for delta. Gamma is a subset of delta, but it's a L subset, right? It sits within the original language. So when you take the model, that model is going to have an interpretation for the larger language, right? What's the larger language? It has the original constants, but new constant symbols as well, right? And then old function symbols, predicate symbols. Now, all you have got is interpretation for extra elements. Throw them away, right? Once you throw them away, what do you get? You get as an L model, and delta will be true in that, and so you get a L model. This is it, right? Because all the formulas in gamma are true in that L model, and therefore gamma has a model. So this is the outline of the proof. Okay, is the outline clear? This is how we have done it. Now let's go over the details that are involved. When it comes to the details, the first thing is with the semantics itself. Okay, let me try this. We'll use too much. Okay. We had this notion of the formula alpha prime obtained substituting all free occurrences of x in t in alpha by t, right? So this we define. What is this thing? You go through the formula alpha, wherever the variable x has a free occurrence, right? It's sitting there. What does a free occurrence means? It's not within the scope of any quantifier, right? That x is not sitting inside sum for all x, right? So that's a free occurrence. You go through that, and wherever you see x, substitute it by t. This is the notion that we had, and we also had this notion t is substitutable for x in alpha. Not every term is substitutable for x in alpha, because when you do that, something that's a bound variable, for instance, if you had t was a variable y, and in alpha there is a subformula saying there exists y something, what will happen is x is now free. Now you substitute y in that occurrence now becomes captured, right? It's then becomes bound. A free variable becomes bound by substitution, and that creates problems. Again and again, the canonical example you should keep in mind is this: for all x there exists y, x not equal to y. This may be in general true in a model, but the moment I put x equals y here, right, when I substitute there exists y, y not equals y is not true in any model, right? That's not satisfiable at all. Y, you cannot have a y such that y is not equal to y, right? So y is not substitutable for x in this formula variable. So this definition basically ensures that once you have this, we have the proposition if t is substitutable for x and alpha, then for any model m satisfies alpha with x replaced by t if and only if m, if you take the model variant, m satisfies this formula alpha with x replaced by t. That is the same as saying you go into the model, right, assign whatever is the element, evaluate the term t, whatever is the domain element you get, look at that assignment, in that model variant alpha holds, right. So doing a syntactic substitution out there is the same as doing the model assignment. So this is the notion that how we have defined the semantics. This is our intuitive notion of substitution, and these two coincide. What this proposition assures us is that your intuition about, for a quantifier, putting something into the formula and checking that it's true is actually correct as long as you are making sure that substitutability is maintained, right? This is what we saw, and this turns out to be something important in the proof that we do. Now, if t is an arbitrary term, in general it may not be substitutable, right? Therefore, what do? So the next is an observation or a proposition. For every formula alpha and term t with free variable with x free in it and term t, there exists a formula alpha prime such that t is substitutable for x in alpha prime, and this is very important. What are we saying? You give me any formula alpha, you give me a term t, variable x, right, such that you have this formula alpha with x occurring free. You've taken this term t, in general it may not be substitutable, but there exists another formula alpha prime which is logically equivalent to alpha. Remember this notation, this says this formula is valid, right? This equivalence is valid. No matter what model you take, these two formulas will be the same, right? There exists such a formula, and in that one alpha prime, substitutability is exactly what you want. This for this particular t, right? Maybe I should even call it alpha t instead of alpha prime. We have, right? Because for a term t, we are saying there exists such a thing, right? I have taken alpha and the term t, I can always rewrite alpha in some particular way so that I get this alpha t which is logically equivalent. Is this idea clear? This is what?
Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I did not get this proposition.
What is the statement of the proposition? The statement of the proposition is, in general, if I take an alpha and a term t, right, alpha has a free variable x, t need not be substitutable for x in alpha, like that's what we've got here, right? Now, in such a situation, you can always take the formula, rewrite it in such a way that the term t becomes substitutable in the equivalent formula. For instance, here I can always rewrite it as for all x there exists z such that x is not equal to z. Now these two formulas are logically equivalent. In fact, there exists y, x not equal to y is logically equivalent to there exists z, x is not equal to z. Right? Is this clear? And in fact,
Yes.
this is also equivalent. For all x there exists y, x not equal to y is logically equivalent to for all x there exists z, z not equal to y. I mean x not equal to z. Yeah? This is all we are talking about. You can always rename your bound variables in such a way that you do get a formula that is equivalent and in which you can do whatever substitution you want.
Yes, sir.
Moreover, because of this, we can also say for all x alpha. Is this clear? This is exactly like what I have written here. You can always rewrite in. And the proof is absolutely straightforward. Proof. What do? Well, look at t, right? Look at all the variables in t, right? And now look at all those occurrences that you have got there. T is in this case y, right? You go back, you go inside and simply rename all bound variables, right? That's all you are saying, right? So rename all bound variables inside alpha to get alpha prime such that alpha t, right? Let me just write it like this. You bound variables of alpha t intersection t is empty. This is all you want, right? All, I mean, remember I can't write it like this because you have to worry about bound occurrences. But I hope you know what's going on. You go inside alpha, right? Wherever you see any variable in t occurring, simply rename the variables. The point is you just go rename all the bound variables in such a way there is no clash with any term, intersection bar t, sorry. Yeah? There should be no variable in t, in the term t, which actually occurs bound in your new formula. Just rename all the variables. Then alpha and alpha prime, alpha t are basically variants only in bound variables, right? Such formulas are equivalent. This should be, so I think I can take this off now, right? We have got enough paisa for this. So now I have to prove that these two are equivalent. Why is that? Well, in general, Qx alpha is equivalent to Qy where y does not occur in alpha. This is a valid formula. You can sit and do this carefully. If consider a formula of, when I say Qx, I mean it can be for all x or there exists x. There are two validities here. This is for all x alpha is equivalent to for all y alpha with x replace y. There exists x alpha is equivalent to there exists y alpha with x replaced by y. Where y is a new variable. That's all that we are saying. Is the point clear? If y does not occur in this at all, if I go and replace every occurrence of the binding, the quantifier Qx by Qy, it makes no difference. It satisfies the same set of form, right? Is it clear? Both are logically equivalent, and this is a routine proof. Yeah. Somebody? Well, take a model, right? You want to show that this is valid, right? Take a model where the left hand side holds, right? Then for every element, domain element D, look at the model variant, it will satisfy alpha. Now you want to show that this is also true in that model, right? Well, what do you have to do? Look at any assignment for y, right? Now this is alpha with x replaced by y, right? So you just assign the same element, right? And then check that both x and y are mapping to D and the thing holds, right? Because the same element, that's all. This is a fairly routine proof. You just go over it and check. And this is something that we do all the time, right? I mean, rename bound variables, right? How does it matter whether you call it x or y, right? There exists x, Px is the same as saying there exists y Py. As long as that y is not occurring in the original one, I can always rename. This is what it says, and this makes sure that you can always do this. Is this point clear now? That, and this is what we make use of in the proof, that when we construct a model, we go over inside and you do the thing, right? And this is what we make use of. The other important thing that comes with substitutions is this. This is another important validity. In any model, this implies, this is a validity means what? Take any model, this implication is true. That means if that model satisfies for all x alpha, right? Okay, why should this be true? Take a model M. I want to say that for all x alpha holds here, assume that. Okay, then alpha should be true in the model for every element D on earth that you can assign to it. Okay. Now suppose this formula alpha with x replaced by t is not true in that model. Suppose M satisfies for all x alpha, but M does not satisfy alpha with x replaced by t. What do we know? Well, t is substitutable, therefore this proposition kicks in. This one says, therefore, M with x to pi hat of d does not satisfy alpha, right? This is the whole content of this proposition. If I look at the model M, right, consider the model variant where x is assigned whatever is the element when you evaluate the term t comes out to be. For that assignment, alpha does not hold, but this is some element d belonging to the domain. So there is some model, so there is some assignment of an element to x such that alpha is violated. This contradicts, right? The model is supposed to satisfy for all x alpha. How could it do that? Because there is an element that's a counterexample here. Is this clear? So this is a validity, and this is what we make use of, right? So we know now that as far as substitutable terms are concerned, whenever for all x alpha is there, this will get in, and this is what is made use of in the proof. Okay, so let us go over that bit of proof also to make sure that you understand the details. Is this clear? Yeah. So okay, so this is valid, and this is a proposition. So let me get rid of these. There is a crucial, now what is our notion of, okay, so this already tells me that this, whenever, remember this, right? Whenever alpha implies beta is a valid formula and alpha belongs to gamma, which is finsat and complete, then beta belongs to gamma. Once a set is finsat and complete, right? If alpha implies beta is valid and alpha belongs to gamma, then beta also must belong to gamma. Why? Suppose not. Suppose alpha belongs to gamma, your finsat complete set, but beta doesn't belong to gamma. By completeness, you know that not beta belongs to gamma. Then alpha and not beta is a finite subset of gamma, right? So alpha not beta should be satisfiable. It's a finite subset, therefore, remember it's finsat, so this is a satisfiable set of formulas. How can this be satisfiable if alpha implies beta is valid? The model that satisfies this will satisfy alpha and make beta false, right? So this is not possible. So this is always true. I mean, these things should become like second nature, this kind of arguments. That's very important in the way we do things. That's why these kind of notions I've been doing slowly over several times. Right? So now we know that for all x alpha belongs to gamma, and T, so if gamma is finsat and complete, T is substitutable for X in alpha, then this is something we can make use of, right? So, and when it is witness fulfilled, you also, witness fulfilled says there exists X alpha belongs to gamma, implies alpha with belongs to gamma for some T substitutable for X in alpha. This is also given to us, right? So now that's all. This is all that we need to complete that. These two statements and this proposition, these things together give you what you need for doing the proof. The truth lemma has that inductive step for quantifiers, and that's taken care of by these assertions. So let's go over that. In the truth lemma, we have to show for all X alpha belongs to gamma, or yeah, there exists if only if M delta satisfies for all X alpha, right? This is what we need to prove. This is the same as saying, okay, for all X alpha belongs to gamma implies for all X alpha does not belong to gamma. So these are two statements to be proven. Yeah. Statement 2 is the witness fulfilled business. Statement 2, for all X alpha does not belong to gamma implies there exists X not alpha belongs to gamma. Remember, not of for all X alpha is the same as there exists X not alpha. I hope that's clear. Yeah. This is a validity, right? Not for all X alpha. Yeah. Okay. By witness fulfilled, I know that not alpha with X replaced by T belongs to gamma for some suitable T. Okay. Now by induction, so therefore I know that alpha with X replaced by T does not belong to not gamma. This is all delta, right? Yeah. Delta is our, yeah, is this clear? Witness fulfilled says that there must be something that you have substituted, right? Okay. Therefore alpha does not belong. Then by induction hypothesis, M delta does not satisfy alpha with X replaced by T. Right? This is what induction hypothesis will give you. Remember, we are doing this proof by induction on structure of formula, right? So we are considering the quantifier case. So this is a simpler formula. So if right, this is exactly what the induction hypothesis will be. Now, since this is a suitable T, I can apply this proposition, and therefore I know that M delta with X mapped to pi hat of T does not satisfy alpha, right? But this is the same as saying M delta does not satisfy for all X alpha, which is what we needed. This is exactly what we are supposed to prove. Yeah, there is some domain element for which alpha is not true, therefore for all X alpha is not true in the model. So this takes care of number 2. Is it clear? Just make sure that you understand all the steps. This is the proposition that's critical, right? And that's what we keep using throughout. Yeah. You start with the fact that for all X alpha does not belong to delta, then there exists X not alpha belongs. By witness fulfilled, there is some witness for this, and then alpha doesn't belong, then apply induction hypothesis, use this proposition, and you get that. What about the other, number 1? Okay. It's again using just these propositions. All the work has been already done, the propositions. Yeah. Okay. We have it here, you can make use of. Okay. So suppose we are doing 1 here. Suppose for all x alpha belongs to gamma. We want to prove that the model satisfies for all x alpha, right? So, but the model does not satisfy for all x alpha. Well, if the model doesn't satisfy it, what do we know? Then for some term t, for some element of the domain, right? That's what it means. For some element of the domain, does not satisfy alpha, because the domain elements are all equivalence classes, right? I have to write pi hat of t, which is the same as the equivalence class of t. This is the situation. Well, this is some arbitrary term t, so we don't know whether, yeah, understand, this t may not be substitutable for x and alpha, we don't know anything about it, right? But given t and alpha, I know that there exists an alpha prime such that, remember, there exists an alpha prime which I have called alpha t here, which is okay for, let me write it okay for t, right, such that t is substitutable for x and alpha prime. And importantly, these two are valid. That means in any model where this is not true, this is also not true, right? So therefore, there exists alpha prime such that does not satisfy alpha prime. Yeah, there is a formula alpha prime which is logically equivalent to alpha, where I can actually do the substitution, right? Alpha prime is not true in this model. This equivalence is a validity, therefore any model that violates alpha must violate alpha prime as well. That's what we are saying. Now use this proposition again, the most useful proposition on earth, which says that if it is substitutable, then I can always pull it to the right hand side. By this proposition, m delta does not satisfy alpha prime with x replaced by t. Is this clear? Because you can always pull it to this side, because it is substitutable. Therefore, I know that the model does not satisfy for all x alpha prime. Yeah, because there is a, we know that, okay, it doesn't belong, is what, sorry. So by induction hypothesis, alpha prime with x does not belong to delta. Right? If your model doesn't satisfy it, by induction hypothesis, it is not there in delta. Remember that the if and only if holds for the induction hypothesis. Yeah? Induction hypothesis applies and I can make this claim. Now I have this closure condition. Whenever for all x alpha belongs to your set model set and t is substitutable for x and alpha, alpha with x replaced by t will be there. This is not there, therefore I know that for all x alpha prime does not belong to delta. Is this clear? That follows from our. But now we have a problem. We said for all x alpha prime implies for all x alpha. Right? Remember, these two are logically equivalent. But then for all x alpha prime does not, okay, I should take this. This does not belong to delta, there, but now we have for all x alpha belongs to delta. This is a validity, but for all x alpha prime does not belong to delta, and that's a contradiction. Yeah, we started with the assumption that for all x alpha belong, I keep saying gamma and delta, please forgive me for this. Yeah. Yeah. For all x alpha belongs to delta, this implication is a validity. Therefore, I would expect for all x alpha prime should belong to delta, but we have got it doesn't belong. That's a contradiction, right? Remember we said that whenever alpha implies beta as a validity, if you have alpha in your set, beta also must be there in that set. FinSat and complete forces us to put such formulas in our set. Therefore, this is a contradiction. So, these steps are all delicate and detailed, and one should be very careful that you follow the details. So, this completes the proof of the truth lemma, right? The truth lemma which says this, right? Except that I have to write delta instead of gamma here. I am very sorry about that. I should correct. I keep making this mistake. Yeah. And the earlier steps of the truth lemma are all something that we had already seen. Without quantifiers, we could go through the proof and check that everything was correct. So, this is the only thing left. So, this takes care of the fact that if you are given a set that is FinSat, complete and witness fulfilled, then it has a model. This is what we have basically done the proof of. You construct the model. How do you construct the model? Start with the terms, right? Define this equivalence relation on terms by saying T equals T prime belongs to delta. Show that it's a congruence, then quotient it, that gives you, right? Take the set of all equivalence classes, that gives you the domain, and the interpretation is exactly what you would expect. Interpretation of a constant symbol is the equivalence class of C. Assignment to a variable x is the equivalence class of x, and then you've got a congruence, so you can show that pi hat of t is exactly the equivalence class of t, and that gives you the fact that t1 equals t2 belongs to delta if and only if t1 equals t2 is true in the model. They both map to the same equivalence class. And the interpretation of predicate symbols is exactly by consulting delta. If delta says p, t1 through tm is there, then you take the tuple of equivalence classes t1 through tm and then put it in the relation, right? That ensures that the atomic formulas go through. FinSat and complete lets you lift the truth lemma for the Boolean cases, negation, disjunction, implication, all of them. The quantifier case we went through. This is the outline of the proof. The only thing is, how do you start from a FinSat set and get something that is FinSat complete and witness fulfilled? So that was the Lindenbaum construction, and let me just go over the details of that also. And again, you will see that this critical proposition is something that we keep using all the time, right? That's I must say that if there is one paisa vasool proposition that you prove and make use of, it is this one. Something that you keep using all the time. Very simple and really nice thing. It shows the semantics of the quantifier in a very nice way. And that little trick, as I said, that's Gödel's trick. And this proof that I'm presenting is essentially what Gödel proved in 1930. So this is Gödel's proof of compactness theorem. As I said, it's not exactly, it's really Henkin construction with Gödel's idea combined together. So what I'm giving is Henkin-Gödel construction. And normally many books like Enderton or Mendelssohn, many other books do the proof of completeness theorem, which we'll see later, and use compactness as a corollary. But I prefer this because this just gives you directly a proof that we have gone through. Okay. So, as I said, the Gödel trick is really, where do you get this witness from, right? If you want to make it witness fulfilled, you want to, for there exists x alpha, you have to find a substitutable term and substitute it. Where do you find it? Because gamma in general is FinSat and complete, doesn't mean it needs to be witness fulfilled. So you have to find where do you manufacture a term, right? So the idea is very simple. You start with your language L, First order logic language, when we look at, defining the language only means that you have some vocabulary, some constant symbols, function symbols, predicate symbols. So expand it to a new language L prime. Right. So what you do is to find a new constant symbols, not an L. That is the meaning of new. Right. Expand a set of constants to a larger set of constants. Add countably many new constant symbols. Right. So the advantage is that whenever you look at it, you know that it's a new symbol. Right. Now look at the L prime formulas. Remember that you are not adding function symbols, predicate symbols and so on, right? So the only way new stuff will appear in the expanded language is by, you will be able to look at it and know that, that's here, there's a new symbol. That's the idea. It doesn't clash with anything that is there. It's a disjoint union, right? Now, what are L prime models? L prime models are going to be of the form some domain. This is some script D, by the way. And this is some domain interpretation. This is L prime interpretation and pi, right? This is how your L prime model is going to look. So what will this L prime interpretation have? It will have interpretation for C symbols as well as D symbols, right? So this will map every element C to some element of the C to D and also D to D. This is what it's going to do, right? Now, whenever I take an L prime model and define its projection to L, I can define, so this let me call projection. What will be a projection of M to L? It will be projection to C, right? Basically, you take the same domain, right? Now, what is this interpretation map? Interpretation map for function symbols will be identical, right? Function interpretation assignment for variables will be identical. Only thing is, where you had an interpretation for elements of C as well as elements of D, you're going to have only, that's why I said it's a projection to C, that's all, right? You throw away the rest of it, right? That's all. So consider, if I take any model of the expanded language, throw away the extra interpretations that I have got, I get a model of the original language. And it's an easy exercise to show that for all alpha belonging to L, this is important. If I take an L formula, right, M, which is an L prime model, let me call this in L prime, right, satisfies alpha, implies M projected to L satisfies alpha. This is because all you have got is whatever witness you had, right? I have no problem. There is some element that is there in the domain, right? For there exists X alpha, for instance, there is some element in the domain, right? In this model, because the model satisfies all these. Yeah? So, if I take all original formulas, right? As long as the formula doesn't mention the new symbols, right? If I take the original formulas, if they are true in the expanded language, right? If you are true, the model of the expanded language, if it's true in M, which is an L prime model, then when I take the model restriction here, it's true in the original. This is what Gödel uses, right? You start with gamma, expand the language, and in the expanded language, you construct a set delta, build a model for delta, right? Build a model for delta, and now if you look at gamma, which is only L formulas, right, they will all be true in the projected model. Therefore, if delta has an L model, if delta has an L prime model, then gamma has, let me call this M here, an L model which is nothing but M projected to L. Yeah? You throw away, all you are throwing away is the interpretation for new things, right? The interpretation that you need for your old symbols you have. The interpretation for function symbols you have. The interpretation for, so for all the terms of the original language you know how to interpret, right? So that's there. You have not thrown away. And this is what is very nice, that for existential quantifiers, I mean, there's a fundamental thing that you use in model theory all the time, that for existential quantifiers, if I find a witness, whenever I go into some substructure, right, I can use that particular witness. That's not a problem, right? So yeah, okay, so is this part clear? So it suffices, so you start with L, go over to L prime, gamma lives in L, in L prime you construct delta and construct a model for delta, it suffices. It suffices to show, so gamma, which was Finsat, you extend to delta in L, which is an L prime theory, which is Finsat complete and witness fulfilled, suffices to prove that delta has an L prime model. Is this very clear? I hope there is no confusion in this. Yeah. So you start with a set which is Finsat, but that's a set of formulas in L. You expand the language and you construct a set delta which includes gamma, which is Finsat complete and witness fulfilled, but this is a set in L prime. You show that delta has an L prime model, which we just went through, right? We just looked at delta, defined M delta, did the truth lemma, and we actually construct, what we construct is an L prime model. By this observation, then we know that the original set gamma has an L model, which is all we want. So it suffices to prove this, and that's what is taken up. So the only thing left is to show that you can start with gamma and actually extend it to such a delta. Then that completes the proof. That's the Lindenbaum construction. How do you do that? Is this all clear? Right? Can I take it off? Yeah. Okay. So what do? Enumerate the formulas of L prime, right? Remember that we are enumerating the formulas of L prime, not L. This has got new constant symbols, therefore new terms, plug in the new terms into atomic formulas, throw in with quantifiers, everything. It's only the atomic formulas that will be different. All the rest will be the same, but then you can lift it. You can now say something like R T1 T2 implies R T1 prime, T2 prime, and so on, where these play with different sets of terms. So you get a new complicated language, enumerated, but it's all countable, right? So alpha 1, alpha 2, and so on. Define gamma 0 contained in gamma 1 contained in this, as usual, by gamma 0 is given the gamma, which is Finsat, and then gamma k plus 1, maybe I should write it here, equals gamma k union, there exists x alpha, rated beta. If alpha k is of the form there exists x beta, right? Di is the least element of D not in gamma k, gamma k union alpha k, and this whole set, call it gamma prime. Yeah. Consider in the enumeration alpha k. If alpha k is of the form there exists x beta, then pick the least element that is not used so far. Not used so far in gamma k, and there must exist such a thing, right? Because we have considered up to k stages, each time I am using one new constant symbol, so at most k new constant symbols would have been used. It may not be exactly k, that is why I have put I here, right? Because in some, when you examine some of the formulas, you may not have, they may not have been of the form, existential form at all, right? So you may not have added. So if k is 1000, maybe you have added some 100 new constant symbols, right? This is the 101st, right? Put it in. That's what we are saying, right? And check that this is FinSat. That's important, right? This is one case, gamma k union alpha k. If alpha k is not of the form there exists x beta and gamma k union alpha k is FinSat. You have looked at alpha k. If it is at the existential form, this is what you do. If it is not at the existential form, it's some other formula alpha. Just check that if that union is FinSat, put it in. Otherwise, leave it alone. Yeah, this is the definition of gamma k plus 1. Clearly, that includes gamma k. Therefore, it's a chain, and then you define delta to be union over k greater than or equal to 0 gamma k, right? And then you observe first that for all k, gamma k is FinSat, therefore delta is FinSat, delta is complete, delta is witness fulfilled. Yeah? And these proofs are exactly like what we did earlier. And that, lo and behold, you get a set which is FinSat complete and witness fulfilled. But there is a catch. What's the catch? Well, if gamma k union, well, we considered there exists x beta, right? Well, we have to prove that if gamma k union there exists x beta is FinSat, then the larger set with the witness is also FinSat, right? Otherwise, you won't be able to add it, right? Because you are checking that it's FinSat, right? So for it to be witness fulfilled, you should be able to show that whenever you can add there exists x beta consistently, you can also add a witness consistently, right? So this is what we need to prove. To prove, yeah, so this is all completely straightforward. So to prove, if gamma union there exists x alpha is FinSat, or another better way of saying is gamma is FinSat, then gamma union alpha with x replaced by c is FinSat, where c is a new constant symbol not occurring in gamma union in gamma. You start with a FinSat set which contains some promise. There exists X alpha. There exists X alpha, you think of as a promise, right? There is an X for which alpha holds. You want to, how will you fulfill the promise? By showing there is a witness, right? And we want to claim that C is actually a potential witness for X in alpha. The point is, you can always find a witness by choosing something that's not occurring in gamma. If you have not mentioned it anywhere, I can always pick that as a witness and put it in. This is what it says. So this is what we need to prove. We can actually prove something stronger. So this is an observation or proposition. C does not occur in gamma or alpha, then this is what is called generalization from constants. And like I said last time, this is a very standard proof principle in mathematics that we are all used to all the time, right? What we do is you take your theory gamma, some set of assumptions, right? Whatever is a mathematical theory that you are working with, you show that alpha for some particular choice of C, right? Choose some name C, right? And prove that from the assumptions alpha, the property that you're looking for, follows for that particular choice of C. And then you say the choice of C was arbitrary, right? It doesn't depend on, nothing in gamma depends on C. Nothing in the statement that you're talking about depends on C. This is a completely arbitrary statement. Therefore, it holds for all X in alpha, right? For X, I chose a particular element C and did the entire proof. But then I claimed that nowhere have I used that particular element anywhere. The choice was completely arbitrary. Therefore, it holds for all X, right? Remember proofs of this kind? I mean, math books are full of these things. That's exactly what we are talking about. Now, this proposition immediately implies what you need to prove. Do you see that? Well, okay. Suppose not, right? Suppose gamma is FinSat and there exists X alpha belongs to gamma, but this is not FinSat. It's not FinSat means what? There is a, let gamma prime be a finite subset of gamma union not satisfiable. Yeah? Well, if gamma prime was a finite subset of gamma, gamma was FinSat, so it must be satisfiable. So this gamma prime cannot come entirely from gamma. That's clear, right? So therefore, gamma prime is of the form gamma double prime union. Yeah? There is some finite subset of this and I added this and that became unsatisfiable. Remember, so this is a subset of gamma. This one is satisfiable, but the moment I added this witness, it became unsatisfiable. That's what it means, right? This is unsatisfiable. Therefore, I know that gamma double prime gives you this. Yeah? What does it mean to say that this set is unsatisfiable? It means that the negation of this formula is a logical consequence of these assumptions, right? This is exactly the meaning of gamma double prime consequence this. We know this, right? Yeah. But by proposition, gamma double prime gives you for all X not alpha. Remember, C is new. C is a new constant symbol. It doesn't occur in gamma, therefore it doesn't occur in gamma double prime. It doesn't occur in alpha, therefore it doesn't occur in negation alpha. So it's a new thing. So by generalization from constants, we know that gamma double prime gives you for all X not alpha as a consequence. By monotonicity, gamma gives for all x not alpha as a consequence. We know this, right? The monotonicity of the consequence relation. Once something is a consequence, take a larger set, it will continue to be a consequence. But this contradicts the fact there exists x alpha belongs to gamma, right? Remember, yeah? Gamma gives for all x not alpha as a consequence. That means what? Take any model M, right? If it satisfies all of gamma, it must give you for all x not alpha. But there exists alpha is actually sitting here. Therefore, in particular, gamma gives there exists x alpha, right? It belongs to gamma, and that this contradicts satisfiability of, in fact, in particular, finsat of gamma. Gamma was a finsat, and how is that possible? Yeah. So this already tells you that you can't. So this is the important point, right? If you prove this proposition, all the rest is completed. Now, why is this true? So is it clear that it's only generalization from constants that's important? From that, the Lindenbaum construction is completed. So to prove that, you have to prove this. And this is our good old stuff back again. Any question, anything related to this? So this is the only one left. Okay. So let's take off all this stuff. All this is now not important. Yeah. Okay. So let's assume this thing. Suppose we just write C nu, right? But then what do we know? We know that gamma union there exists x negation alpha is satisfiable. Negation of this I am just writing this, right? If this is not a logical consequence, it must be the case that along with the assumptions there exists x not alpha, this together is satisfiable. Let M be a model. Let me just write this. M is a model of gamma. Yeah? Right. Now what can I look at this? Okay. So there is some variant M with that satisfies negation alpha. Yeah. Is it clear? Because that's what it means, right? For some element, for some domain element, we know that it satisfies negation alpha. Now, consider M prime. Yes. Consider the model M prime, which is the same as M. So, if let M be the model, some d I pi. So, M prime is the same as d I prime pi, where you keep the same domain, keep same assignment to variables. The only thing that you do is what is I prime? I prime of C is the same as the domain element D. All the rest is identical, right? So I should write it as I prime of C prime equals D when C equals C prime, and I of C prime otherwise. Yeah. For the particular element C, you assign whatever is the D that we have got. The interpretation for the new constant symbol that we have picked, right, is D. For all the rest, you take the old one. Now, remember that the formula alpha doesn't mention C at all. We know this, right? This is a new formula alpha, right? It's new. Does not occur in gamma or alpha. Remember that the truth of a formula depends only on the interpretation to all the things occurring in this, right? Therefore, I know that M prime satisfies negation alpha. Is this clear? M prime, remember it's a variant, X has been replaced by D here, and I've got the same interpretation for the constant symbol, right? So I'm sorry, with X replaced by C. Yeah? Remember that a constant, okay, I should actually write like this, M prime with X mapped to pi hat of C satisfies negation alpha, right? In this model M prime, I have the pi hat of C is actually the same element D, therefore both models satisfy. Now I use the fact that it's suitable for substitution. Therefore, remember that a constant symbol is always substitutable for a term T in any formula alpha. So I can always write this as M prime satisfies not alpha with X replaced by C. This proposition. Remember, this is what I said is the most useful proposition on alpha. So I can move it to the right hand side because constant term is always substitutable. Now there is something nice. For all gamma, M satisfies gamma, therefore M prime satisfies gamma as well, because gamma doesn't mention C. Yeah, this constant symbol C is not mentioned anywhere in gamma. Remember it? Yeah. So if a formula gamma was made true in the model M, in the new model M prime also it's true. So now we have got so here is a contradiction to our assumption. M prime satisfies all of gamma. By this, M prime should satisfy alpha, but it satisfies negation alpha. So this together contradicts yeah, this was our assumption. And that's a contradiction, and we are done. Is this clear? But every step, remember that this proposition is the critical thing that we always keep using in this. Yeah. So it's a fairly routine statement, like I said last time, but true paisa vasool for doing that. Yeah. Okay. Are the steps clear? Anything? So this completes the proof of the compactness theorem. I'm not going to do it anymore. I've really gone through all the details now, and you can check that all the points are plugged. It's a non-trivial proof of a non-trivial theorem, so it's okay that it takes some bit of work, right? I mean, it's actually nice when you have a long sequence of things where everything comes together and you get a nice statement like that. Yeah. Okay. So in the remaining time, I want to tell you about why we do all this, right? What's so hot about the compactness theorem, right? So the applications of the compactness theorem, it turns out that this is one of the most applied things, right? In fact, a huge amount of model theory starts off by using the compactness theorem. Okay. So once again, So application 1, which we have already seen. If alpha is a consequence of gamma, then there exists a finite subset we have already seen that these two are equivalent statements, therefore that follows as a corollary. And this is something which, as I said, was essential for the Hilbert program, right? Hilbert's program was that I want to replace all these mathematical arguments by finitary means, and once you do that, you should be able to mechanize many things and axiomatize. So this is a very elaborate formal program, and all the infinities that are there, whole lot of stuff is something that we can get rid of. The proofs that we did gives a very nice corollary. Every satisfiable set of formulas has a countable model. I'll put an exclamation mark just to point out to you that there's nothing obvious about this. What are you saying? Take a set of formulas. If it has a model at all, it has a countable model. Why should this be non-obvious? Why does it follow? Firstly, suppose it is satisfiable. We know that it's FinSat, right? By compactness. And we have already gone through this painful exercise. We went through this long to actually what we constructed was a countable model, right? So if it is satisfiable, it's FinSat, and we have just done a proof, right? The proof actually shows that every FinSat set has a countable model. Remember what is the model that we constructed? What are the elements of the domain? Equivalence class of terms. That means that the domain is a countable set. So the model that we constructed was a countable model. Now, this was proved actually long before the compactness theorem, not as a corollary of what I did. It was directly proved by Skolem, 1910, that for first order logic, if a set of formulas has a model, it has a countable model. And this was called Skolem's paradox. It's called Skolem's paradox, not because there is any paradox in it at all. People those days were 1910, right? This is 5 years after Russell's paradox, whole lot of all that stuff, and people thought this was a paradox as well. And it seems paradoxical because remember that your formulas could be talking about real numbers. It's just a set of formulas, right? It's an infinite set of formulas. We haven't put anything on the vocabulary, right? You have addition, multiplication, order in the language of rings, let's say, language of fields. So you could be talking about real numbers, you could be talking about complex numbers, right? We have seen all these kind of these things, right? So nothing says that the model for the, that the intended model that you have in mind actually is countable at all. In fact, it may be uncountable. It very often is having the cardinality of the continuum. But then you have produced a countable model. So how can you have a countable model to talk about an uncountable set, right? That's the kind of thing but there is no paradox at all. That's why I put it in quotes. There is nothing paradoxical about this. It's a very clear mathematical statement, right? The point is those elements that you pick as witnesses, you give names to them. And the names come from a countable set. That's all you are saying, right? That way, what is this? This is a name for a real number, right? The real number, if you actually want a decimal representation, that's an infinite sequence. We know that, right? And much worse is this, right? That's a name for a real number, right? I hope there is no ambiguity that it denotes a real number. Yeah. So these are all names that we are talking about, and the names come from a countable set, and that suffices. And somewhere Gödel saw this, right? And that's how he constructed this whole expansion with countably many constant symbols, and Right. As I said, Gödel, you always have to sit and figure out how he thought of this, right? So remarkable trick, right? That takes care of it. Skolem didn't prove it that way. Skolem had a direct proof and went through a lot of torture, and as I said, people were dismissive of that. There were all sorts of stuff happening. But later, of course, by 1930, it was all cleaned up nicely. But this is a very remarkable application of the proof, not of the direct statement itself, but of the proof. A very important second application if gamma has arbitrarily large finite models, then gamma has an infinite model. This is something very nice as well. So take a set of formulas, some theory, right, that you have got. Right? What is very nice is that you are making these statements without worrying about which kind of, is it in the language of order, in the language of graphs, in the language of, we don't care, right? It's just that these are first order formulas, that's all, right? So if you can show that the assumptions that you have got admit models of arbitrarily large finite size, right? Finite, but however large you can, then it must have an infinite model as well, right? Mathematicians are used to talking about limit completions and things, right? So this is some statement of that kind. It says that if you can make it larger and larger, you can always make it infinite. Why does this follow from compactness theorem? Let's see. Define again, as usual, let's expand the language. Let C0, C1 be new constant symbols. Not in gamma. That's all you care for, right? Pick a new countable supply of constant symbols. If it's not there in the language, expand the language. It doesn't matter to us, right? Now define delta to be gamma union Ci not equal to Cj, I not equal to J, right? Basically says C0 is not equal to C1, C1 is not equal to C2, C0 is not equal to C2, etc., etc., right? That they are all distinct. Now, notice that delta is finsat. Why? Why is delta finsat? Well, take any finite subset of delta, right? That will have some part of gamma, and let's say it will have some part of this. We don't care, right? Take any finite subset. Well, that has some finite subset of gamma plus some change, right? Some new distinct elements, it must be there. But we know that gamma has arbitrarily large finite models. Therefore, your friend, the delta prime that we are considering, right? Delta prime, which is a finite subset, has arbitrarily large finite models. So you can always interpret these elements, how many ever that you have picked, finitely many elements. So suppose this forces you to have 1000 distinct elements in the thing. No problem, because it has got arbitrarily large finite models. So delta is finsat. By theorem, by compactness theorem, delta has a model. Yeah? Now, every model of delta must be infinite. Because it has got to have interpretation for the new constant symbols. There are countably many distinct constant symbols, right? I mean, the formulas say that the elements associated with them, the map that they map to, must be distinct elements. Therefore, the domain must be infinite. Is it clear? So this is that. So delta has an infinite model. and therefore gamma has an infinite model as well, because now I can restrict back to the original language, right? This infinite model will make all of gamma true. So gamma has an infinite, and this is a very important application 2.5, if you like, because it's not a new one, it's the same thing, restatement of that. The class of all finite structures is not definable in first order logic by any collection of any set of sentences in particular. That's what you mean. If I take the class of all finite structures, let me call this fin. You fix any language L, you can look at all L structures, right? Let fin denote the class of all infinite structures. Finite structures, right? That fin, there is no gamma. This is what we are saying. There is no gamma such that mod gamma equals fin. So logicians would say that the class of finite structures is not axiomatizable in first order logic. This is how people will say, but this is an informal statement. The formal statement is precisely here. There is no gamma such that the models of gamma is exactly equal to the class of finite structures. Is it clear why this is true? This is a corollary of this, because suppose there exists a gamma such that the models of gamma is exactly equal to the class of all finite structures. It's a class of all finite structures, so that means you have models of arbitrarily large finite cardinality. But then this says that gamma has an infinite model as well, but there is no infinite model in this side. This is in fact the class of all finite structures, so there is no infinite structure anywhere in that. So that's a contradiction. This is a highly non-obvious statement, right? This is a, remember, like I said, you can write assumptions, the class of groups we can write down, the class of abelian groups we can write down, the class of torsion-free groups we can write down, fields of characteristic 0 I can write down, right? So algebraically closed fields I can write down as sets of formulas. But if I want to get exactly the class of, fix some vocabulary, and I want to know, for instance, the class of graphs, I want to simply axiomatize the class of all finite graphs. Can't do it, sorry, that's what it says, right? So this is the beginning of first observation for what is called finite model theory, of great interest to computer scientists, because computer scientists are very often interested in the class of all finite models of some particular structure. Maybe you're looking at ordered sets, you may be looking at lattices, you may be looking at graphs, trees, some partial orders, but you are interested in all finite structures of that kind. This thing says that when you are working with first order formalisms, you are always going to have the infinite hanging around if you are going to look at arbitrarily large finite sets. So the essence of compactness is really that first order logic cannot distinguish between arbitrarily large finite and the infinite. So if you've got large finite sets around, you might as well think of them as infinite and deal with it. There's nothing much you can do beyond that. And I used to teach a course called Discrete Infinite Structures, and one of the most important takeaways from that course is really that in theoretical computer science, we have only two techniques for dealing with something that's arbitrarily large, right, and finite. Because computer science is interested in finite structures, but unbounded structures. You're not interested in, fixed finite structures, but arbitrarily large finite graphs, finite partial orders, whatever, right? Now, there are only two techniques that are really there. One is the compactness theorem. It says that if it's something arbitrarily large, you might as well think of it as infinite and do, nothing will go wrong. Second one, well, which we don't talk about in this course at all, is think of it as random, right? If it is something large, arbitrarily large and finite, use randomness. In fact, these are almost the two heuristics that whole theory is built on. And so compactness, that's why such a fuss is made by logicians about compactness, because it has a very important consequence. Then I have written applications 1 and 2. Application 3 is actually application 3.12. Kind of a recipe for hundreds of such applications. So let me take one example and show you, right? So let's assume that you are talking about the language of graphs. Right? Okay. Now let's assume that G is a graph which is planar. I don't know, I don't want to say that it's planar. It's just I don't want to write a formula to say it's a planar. It's a planar graph given to me, right? And it's a planar graph and it is infinite. V is infinite. I have an infinite planar graph given to me, right? Now I write the following set of formulas gamma G. What does it have? It says that something like this: for all x r over I equal to 1 to 4 Ci of x. It just says that all of them are colored by one of 4 colors, right? Okay. This is one formula. It says for all x, for all y, exy and Ci of x implies not Ci of y. And this is and over. Yeah. This says that if you have colored a vertex with color Ci and there is an edge to vertex y, y is not a colored. It just says that it's a proper coloring, right? Firstly, you say that every vertex gets one of the 4 colors, and whenever there is an edge, the adjacent vertices do not get the same color. So what does this mean? This says that the graph is 4 colorable. That's what it says, right? Now, and then you have to write all those things. Exy for there is, when there is an edge in the graph. So this is, so I have to write v naught, v comma v prime as constants, where v prime has an edge in the graph. And then not v prime, v prime has no edge. Right? So this is an infinite collection of statements. Now, gamma G is finsat. Why? The 4 color theorem, right? What does the Appel-Haken theorem say? It says every finite planar graph is 4 colorable, right? Gamma G is finsat by Appel-Haken. Why? Because take any finite subset, right? It will pick out a finite subgraph of this graph. A finite subgraph of a planar graph is a planar graph as well. It's a finite planar graph. And this says it's 4 colorable, which is true by Appel-Haken. So from this we know that therefore gamma G is satisfiable by compactness. That means that without doing any work at all, we have shown that every infinite planar graph is 4 colorable, right? Those guys did all the hard work to show that every finite planar graph is 4 colorable. You just observe that specifying every such a graph in first order logic is a simple exercise. Therefore, that statement holds for every infinite planar graph as well. And I literally mean that this list is very, very long. Similarly, in when you do your discrete math course, you learn a whole lot of statements about finite structures. Dilworth's theorem, I don't know if you have seen. Dilworth's theorem is actually proved in the finite. Use first order logic to show that Dilworth's theorem extends to the infinite. Hall's theorem on perfect matchings is on finite graphs. You can lift it to infinite graphs by compactness. I can only say that I'll give you some exercises too for you to do, right? So I'll give some examples with discrete mathematics in mind. I'll also give some examples with algebraic structures in mind. Whatever you are comfortable with, you choose and do. Right? I know that there are many math students who are not that comfortable with, who are more comfortable with algebraic structures. There's a whole lot of things that you can do with groups, fields, rings, right? Where again you use compactness to show that some things extend from the finite to the infinite, or that some things are not definable in first order logic, right? But only when you do that, and the technique is all very similar. You come up with an appropriate set of formulas in each case and use FinSat to show that, apply compactness, and that's it, right? So as I said, I will send you some exercises. Once you see that, there is actually lots and lots of applications of compactness everywhere you will find, right? So it's important both from the viewpoint of people who are interested in analysis and algebra, where you use compactness to get limit points, do many things, or from combinatorics, mainly to show that several arguments that we prove in the finite extend to the infinite very smoothly, right? So that's okay. So this is basically all about compactness theorem. The next class, I want to take up the notion of deductions. That's a new topic. Which is really what everybody assumes that logic is about, which is really about inference, showing that there is a proof of alpha from a set of assumptions, gamma, right? What are proof systems, how we do proof deductions, and then we'll relate it to the notion of consequence that we have worked so far, so hard on, right? So compactness will again show up out there, and you will see that there's nice connections between all these models and deductions. Okay, so that's what we'll take up from Thursday. Thank you. Again, sorry for taking a few minutes more. Any questions on this? Again, my request is please go over the proof of compactness that I went through in all the detail. Make sure that you understand all the steps. I don't want to come back to this ever again in the course, but there are lots of details here, but which are very useful. That's why I've taken so long. I think we took at least 3 or 4 lectures to go over this whole business, right? Okay. Any questions, anything? If not here, post it on Slack and we can take up a discussion. Thank you.